They called me the family disappointment, the one who never amounted to anything, but that day when the lawyer looked directly at me and said those words that would change everything forever, my entire family's world shattered like glass hitting concrete. I was sitting in that mahogany-paneled office, surrounded by relatives who had spent decades treating me like I was invisible, watching them practically salivate over what they thought would be their windfall from grandfather's estate. The November rain was beating against the tall windows, creating shadows that seemed to dance across their greedy faces as they waited for their names to be called. You could feel the tension in the room, thick as summer humidity, everyone calculating in their heads what they deserved, what they had coming to them. My cousin Marcus kept adjusting his expensive tie, the one he bought specifically for this occasion, while my sister Sarah sat there with that satisfied smirk she always wore when she thought she was about to get something I wouldn't. They had positioned themselves closest to the lawyer's desk, leaving me in the back corner like always, the afterthought, the one they only remembered existed when they needed someone to blame for something. The leather chair beneath me creaked as I shifted, and several heads turned my way with those familiar looks of irritation, as if my very presence was disrupting their moment of anticipated triumph. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that everything they thought they knew about me was about to be turned completely upside down. The storm outside seemed to mirror what was building in that room, and I could feel something electric in the air, something that told me this day would be different from every other day they had made me feel small. What they didn't know was that grandfather and I had shared secrets they never bothered to learn about. What they didn't know was that while they were busy dismissing me, I had been building something extraordinary. Before I share what happened next, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are listening from. I love hearing how far my story reaches, and somehow knowing you're there makes telling this easier. Growing up in our family was like living in a house where everyone had assigned roles, and mine was always the disappointment. Marcus was the golden boy, the one who went to business school and came back talking about market strategies and profit margins, speaking a language that made my parents beam with pride. Sarah was the achiever, the one with the law degree hanging on her wall and the corner office downtown, the one who could do no wrong in their eyes. My other cousins filled their own successful niches, each one carving out their place in the family hierarchy while I remained at the bottom, the one they introduced with apologetic explanations and uncomfortable silences. Family dinners were exercises in endurance, sitting through conversations about promotions and achievements and accomplishments that had nothing to do with me. They would discuss business deals and legal cases and career moves while I sat there like a ghost, present but not really seen, included but never truly belonging. When anyone asked about me, the answers came in dismissive waves, hands waved in my direction as if to brush away an inconvenient truth. "He's still figuring things out," they would say, or "he's going through a phase," or my personal favorite, "he's just not cut out for the family business." The family business that none of them actually understood, the empire that grandfather had built from nothing, the legacy they all assumed they were entitled to simply by sharing his last name. They saw the money, the properties, the investments, but they never saw the man behind it all, never bothered to understand what really mattered to him. While they were busy networking and climbing corporate ladders, I was the one who spent afternoons with grandfather in his study, listening to stories about building something from nothing. I was the one who drove him to his doctor appointments when everyone else was too busy with their important careers. I was the one who sat with him during those long evenings when the medications made him tired and confused, when he needed someone to just be present without judgment or agenda. But they never saw those moments, never knew about the conversations we had about legacy and purpose and what it really means to build something that lasts. They were too focused on their own reflections in the mirror of success to notice that grandfather and I had formed a bond they couldn't understand. To them, I was just the family failure, the one who couldn't hold down a traditional job, the one who lived in a small apartment and drove an old car and didn't wear expensive suits to family gatherings. They measured success in dollars and degrees and titles, never bothering to consider that there might be other ways to measure a life worth living. When grandfather got sick, they visited in shifts, checking boxes on their obligation lists, bringing flowers and staying just long enough to feel good about themselves. But I was there in the quiet moments, the ones that don't come with visiting hours or social media posts, the times when he needed someone to understand that dying is just as much about living as it is about leaving. He would tell me stories about his childhood, about coming to this country with nothing but determination and a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except him. He talked about the mistakes he made, the lessons he learned, the people who believed in him when believing seemed foolish. Most importantly, he talked about what he wanted his legacy to be, not just the money and the businesses, but the values and the principles that had guided him through decades of building something meaningful. Those conversations shaped me in ways my family never understood, taught me things that no business school could ever teach, gave me a foundation they couldn't see because they were too busy looking for conventional markers of success. While Marcus was learning about profit margins, I was learning about integrity. While Sarah was mastering legal strategies, I was discovering what it means to serve something greater than yourself. While my cousins were building their careers, I was building character alongside a man who had already proven that true wealth comes from more than just accumulating assets. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife, all of them positioning themselves as the rightful heirs to grandfather's empire, while completely missing what had made that empire possible in the first place. They saw the end result but ignored the foundation, wanted the fruits but dismissed the roots, coveted the crown but never learned what it meant to serve. Grandfather saw all of this, watched them perform their roles as dutiful family members while missing the deeper currents that really mattered to him. He would smile and nod when they visited, accept their performative affection and their calculated attention, but I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what was happening. He was measuring them not by their words, but by their actions, not by their promises, but by their presence, not by what they wanted from him, but by what they were willing to give. And in those measurements, I was the only one who passed the test they didn't even know they were taking. The months leading up to his death were filled with more of those meaningful conversations, more moments of connection that went deeper than small talk and status updates. He would ask me about my dreams, not the ones my family thought I should have, but the ones that came from my heart, the ones that aligned with values rather than just ambitions. We talked about responsibility and stewardship, about the difference between earning something and simply inheriting it, about what it means to be worthy of trust and confidence. He never explicitly told me what was in his will, never made promises or guarantees, but there was something in those conversations that felt like preparation, like he was getting me ready for something the others weren't even aware was coming. The day he died, they all gathered around his bedside, suddenly available after weeks of being too busy to visit regularly. They performed their grief with the same calculated precision they had performed their affection, saying the right words and making the appropriate gestures while already thinking ahead to what came next. I stood in the back of the hospital room, watching this final performance, feeling the weight of all those private conversations, all those moments of genuine connection that had prepared me for this moment in ways I was only beginning to understand. The funeral was a spectacle of family unity, everyone playing their parts perfectly, giving speeches about grandfather's legacy and their commitment to honoring his memory. But even as they spoke about legacy, I could see them calculating inheritance. Even as they talked about honor, I could feel them measuring their expected returns. They had turned grief into opportunity, mourning into marketing, and somehow managed to make even his death about their own prospects. Standing at his graveside, listening to their hollow words about carrying on his work, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation, knowing that they had no idea what carrying on his work actually meant. The weeks that followed were filled with speculation and whispered conversations, family members calling each other to compare notes and share theories about what the will might contain. They were confident in their calculations, certain that the estate would be divided according to their own sense of fairness and entitlement, never considering that grandfather might have had his own ideas about who deserved what. Marcus was already making plans for his portion, talking about investment strategies and business expansions as if the money was already in his account. Sarah was researching tax implications and legal structures, preparing to maximize whatever windfall was coming her way. The others were making their own preparations, each one convinced that their relationship with grandfather entitled them to a significant share of his wealth. But none of them were prepared for what was actually coming. None of them had considered that grandfather had been paying attention to more than just bloodlines and birth certificates. He had been watching character, measuring integrity, evaluating who among his family actually understood what he had spent his lifetime building. And in that evaluation, I had somehow scored higher than any of them could have imagined, though I wouldn't understand the full implications until that day in the lawyer's office when everything changed. The summons to the reading came on a Tuesday morning, formal and official, requiring all potential beneficiaries to be present for the official reading of the will. They gathered like vultures circling a carcass, each one dressed for success, each one carrying themselves with the confidence of people who knew they were about to be rewarded for simply existing. I showed up in my regular clothes, carrying none of their confidence, expecting nothing more than whatever token gesture grandfather might have left for the family disappointment. But as I sat in that back corner, watching them preen and position themselves for maximum impact, I felt something stirring inside me, some echo of those conversations with grandfather. Some whisper of possibility that maybe this story wasn't going to end the way any of us expected. The lawyer was setting up his papers, organizing documents with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before, and the tension in the room was becoming almost unbearable. They were all leaning forward in their chairs, ready to hear their names called, ready to claim their prizes, ready to finally get what they had been waiting for since the day grandfather died. But what they didn't know, what was about to shock them into complete silence, was that grandfather had left instructions that would change everything they thought they knew about our family, about me, and about what really matters when building a legacy that lasts. The rain outside was still beating against the windows, but inside that office, a different kind of storm was about to break, one that would wash away all their assumptions and leave them struggling to understand how the family disappointment had somehow become the one who mattered most. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened the leather portfolio that contained grandfather's final words, and I could feel the collective breath-holding of everyone in that room as they prepared to hear their names called in order of importance. But instead of starting with the traditional legal language they expected, he began reading something that sounded more like a letter, something personal and intimate that immediately changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "My beloved family," the lawyer read in grandfather's voice, "I have spent my final months watching each of you, measuring not your accomplishments or your titles, but your hearts and your character and your understanding of what truly matters in this life." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I could see confusion starting to creep across their faces as they realized this wasn't going to be the straightforward distribution of assets they had anticipated. Grandfather had written extensively about his observations, about what he had seen in each of them during his final years, and as the lawyer continued reading, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He wrote about Marcus, acknowledging his business acumen but noting his tendency to measure people by their net worth rather than their intrinsic value. He wrote about Sarah, praising her legal mind but expressing disappointment in how she used her skills to win rather than to serve justice. He went through each family member with surgical precision, seeing them clearly in ways that made them shift uncomfortably in their expensive chairs. But then the lawyer's voice changed, became warmer, more personal, as he began reading about me, and suddenly every eye in that room was focused on my corner with expressions of growing disbelief. He wrote about the afternoons I spent with him, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand the man behind the legend. He wrote about how I listened to his stories without checking my phone, how I asked questions about his values rather than his valuables, how I showed up consistently even when there was nothing obvious for me to gain. The lawyer read grandfather's words about our conversations regarding legacy and responsibility, about how I was the only one who seemed to understand that true wealth comes from service rather than accumulation. He described moments I had forgotten, times when I had helped him without being asked, occasions when I had chosen his company over more exciting opportunities my peers were enjoying. The family was staring at me now with expressions I had never seen before, confusion mixed with something that might have been the first stirrings of respect, or maybe just shock that the family disappointment was being described in terms they didn't recognize. Grandfather had written about the day he had a minor heart episode, and I was the one who drove him to the hospital, staying with him through the night while everyone else was reached by phone but claimed they couldn't come until morning. He wrote about the time I helped him organize his old photographs, listening patiently as he explained the stories behind each image, the history and heritage they represented. Most significantly, he wrote about our discussions of his business philosophy, how I was the only one who seemed to grasp that he had built his empire not just to accumulate wealth, but to create something that could serve future generations in meaningful ways. The lawyer paused in his reading, looking around the room at faces that were growing more stunned by the moment, before continuing with the section that would change everything forever. In recognition of these observations, Grandfather had written, "I have made decisions about my estate that reflect not traditional expectations, but what I believe will best serve the continuation of my life's work and values." The formal language of the will began then, and with each bequest, the room grew quieter and more tense, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting for their names to be called. Marcus received a modest sum, enough to acknowledge the relationship but nowhere near what he had expected, along with a letter explaining that Grandfather hoped he would learn to value people over profits. Sarah received similarly, with her own personal message about using her skills to serve justice rather than just winning cases. Each cousin, each family member received something thoughtful but limited, gifts that seemed designed more to teach lessons than to provide windfalls. The silence in the room was becoming deafening as they began to realize that the bulk of the estate had not yet been distributed, that someone was going to receive the lion's share, and they were starting to understand who that someone might be. But even I wasn't prepared for what came next, the magnitude of what Grandfather had entrusted to me, the responsibility he was placing on my shoulders along with the resources to fulfill it. The lawyer's voice became more formal as he read the central provision of the will, the one that would shift the entire balance of power in our family forever. To my grandson, he read, "The one who understood that wealth is a tool for service rather than a trophy for achievement, I leave the controlling interest in all my business enterprises, my real estate holdings, my investment portfolios, and the responsibility to carry forward the values that built this legacy." The words hit the room like a physical force, and I could see my family members actually recoil as if they had been slapped, their faces going through a progression of emotions from disbelief to anger to something approaching panic. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice cracking as he demanded to know if there had been some mistake, if the lawyer had somehow misread the document. Sarah was frantically taking notes, already calculating legal challenges, already thinking like the attorney she was trained to be. But the lawyer calmly explained that the will had been prepared with multiple witnesses, that Grandfather had been of completely sound mind, and that there were additional provisions that would make any challenges extremely difficult and expensive. Grandfather had anticipated their reactions, had prepared for this moment with the same strategic thinking that had built his empire in the first place. He had included detailed documentation of his decision-making process, video recordings of his explanations, testimony from his doctors about his mental state, and legal structures that would protect his wishes from any attempts to overturn them. But beyond the legal protections, he had also included something more personal, individual letters to each family member explaining his reasoning and expressing his hope that they would eventually understand and accept his decisions. The lawyer began distributing these letters, sealed envelopes with each person's name written in Grandfather's careful handwriting, final communications from beyond the grave. I watched my family members tear open their letters with desperate urgency, each one hoping to find some explanation that would make sense of what they had just heard, some indication that this was all a misunderstanding that could be corrected. But as they read, their faces told the story of final understanding, the realization that Grandfather had made these decisions deliberately and thoughtfully, with full awareness of how they would be received. My own letter was thicker than the others, several pages of Grandfather's thoughts about responsibility and stewardship, about the conversations we had shared and the trust he was placing in me. He wrote about seeing qualities in me that others had overlooked, about recognizing potential that had been dismissed by people who confused noise with substance. Most importantly, he wrote about his confidence that I would use this inheritance not for personal gain, but to continue the work he had started, to build upon the foundation he had laid, to serve others in ways that would honor his memory and values. The letter explained that he had been watching all of us for years, not just during his final illness, but throughout our entire lives, measuring our characters against the standards he had set for himself. He had seen me choose compassion over competition, service over self-interest, integrity over image, and those choices had convinced him that I was the one who could be trusted with his life's work. But even as I read his words of confidence and trust, I was struggling to process the magnitude of what had just happened, the weight of responsibility that had suddenly settled on my shoulders. The businesses, the properties, the investments, the employees who depended on these enterprises for their livelihoods, all of it was now my responsibility, mine to protect and grow and steward into the future. Grandfather had built this empire over decades, had poured his life into creating something meaningful and lasting, and now he was trusting me to carry it forward in ways that would honor his memory and serve his values. The room was still in shock, my family members staring at their letters, and then at me, trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person grandfather had chosen to inherit everything. I could see them struggling to understand how the family disappointment had somehow become the family heir, how the one they had dismissed and overlooked had been secretly chosen for the most important role of all. Marcus was shaking his head in disbelief, muttering about business experience and practical qualifications, as if those conventional measures were the only ones that mattered. Sarah was already planning legal strategies, already thinking about how to challenge what she clearly saw as an unfair and irrational decision. But as I sat there holding grandfather's letter, feeling the weight of his trust and confidence, I realized that this moment had been building for years. Through all those conversations and connections they had never bothered to witness or understand. The lawyer was explaining additional provisions, trust structures, and oversight mechanisms that grandfather had put in place to ensure the smooth transition of leadership. Systems designed to protect both the businesses and the family from the chaos that might otherwise ensue. There were advisory boards and management teams, financial safeguards and legal protections, all designed to support my new role while maintaining the stability that thousands of employees and their families depended upon. Grandfather had thought of everything, had planned for every contingency, had created structures that would allow me to grow into this responsibility while ensuring that his life's work would continue uninterrupted. But even with all these supports in place, I was beginning to understand that my life had just changed in ways I could never have imagined, that the quiet existence I had been living was about to be transformed into something much larger and more complex. The family members were starting to ask questions now, demanding explanations and clarifications, wanting to understand the fine print and the legal implications of what they had just heard. But I was barely listening to their questions, still processing the reality that I was now responsible for an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, businesses that employed thousands of people, investments that affected communities and industries I had never even thought about. The weight of that responsibility was beginning to settle on me like a heavy coat, and I was starting to understand why grandfather had spent so much time preparing me through our conversations, why he had been teaching me about values and principles rather than just techniques and strategies. This inheritance wasn't just about money or power or status. It was about continuing a mission that had defined his entire adult life, about serving something greater than myself in ways that would honor his memory and values. As the lawyer concluded his reading and began organizing the documents that would formalize my new status, I looked around the room at my family members and saw them seeing me for the first time, really seeing me. Not as the disappointment they had always assumed I was, but as the person grandfather had chosen to carry forward his most precious legacy. The silence that followed the lawyer's final words was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a complete absence of sound that seemed to amplify the magnitude of what had just happened in that mahogany-paneled room. I could feel their eyes on me, studying me as if they were seeing me for the first time, trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person grandfather had chosen to inherit his empire. Marcus was the first to break the silence, his voice tight with controlled anger as he demanded to know what qualifications I possibly had to run businesses I had never even worked in. His question hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see the others nodding in agreement, still unable to accept that their assumptions about me had been so completely wrong. But before I could respond, the lawyer cleared his throat and explained that grandfather had anticipated these concerns, had prepared additional documentation that would address their questions about my readiness for this responsibility. He opened another folder and began reading excerpts from performance reviews and recommendation letters, documents I had never known existed, evidence of a parallel life I had been living while they dismissed me as a failure. The first letter was from the CEO of a nonprofit organization where I had been volunteering for 3 years, managing their financial operations and helping them grow from a small local charity into a regional force for good. She wrote about my strategic thinking, my ability to build relationships with donors and community leaders, my skill at developing programs that created measurable impact in people's lives. The family was staring at me with growing confusion, unable to understand how I had been doing meaningful work they had never heard about. The second letter was from a retired Army colonel who had been working with me on a veteran support program, describing my leadership abilities and my commitment to serving others without seeking recognition or personal gain. He wrote about my ability to coordinate complex logistics, manage diverse teams, and maintain focus on mission objectives even under difficult circumstances. Each letter revealed another aspect of my life that I had never shared with them, work I had been doing quietly while they assumed I was accomplishing nothing. The lawyer continued reading testimonials from business leaders who had worked with me on community development projects, from educators who had collaborated with me on scholarship programs, from healthcare administrators who had partnered with me on charity initiatives. Each document painted a picture of someone who had been actively building experience and relationships, someone who had been preparing for leadership roles even while being dismissed as incompetent by his own family. Sarah was frantically taking notes, her legal mind trying to process this new information, trying to understand how I had built this secret resume without any of them knowing about it. But what shocked them even more was learning that grandfather had been aware of all these activities, had been quietly monitoring my work and receiving regular reports about my performance and impact. The lawyer explained that grandfather had been funding many of these programs through anonymous donations, had been watching my involvement and measuring my character through my service to others. He had seen me take on responsibilities without seeking credit, solve problems without demanding recognition, lead teams without needing titles or formal authority. Most importantly, he had seen me make decisions based on values rather than self-interest, choose service over personal advancement, prioritize long-term impact over short-term gains. These were the qualities he had been looking for in a successor, the characteristics he valued more than business degrees or corporate experience. Marcus was shaking his head in disbelief, muttering about how none of this made sense, how traditional business experience should matter more than volunteer work and community service. But the lawyer had more revelations to share, more evidence of grandfather's careful planning and my secret preparation for this moment. He produced documents showing that I had been enrolled in executive education programs for the past 2 years, taking courses in finance and management and leadership, all paid for by anonymous scholarships that had actually come from grandfather's foundations. I had been completing MBA-level coursework while they thought I was wasting my time with insignificant activities, gaining knowledge and skills that would prepare me for exactly this responsibility. The coursework had included intensive programs at prestigious universities, mentorship from successful business leaders, and practical experience managing budgets and teams and strategic initiatives. Grandfather had been orchestrating my education while letting me think I was just pursuing personal interests, providing me with the tools I would need while allowing me to develop my own understanding of what leadership really means. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was yet to come, as the lawyer produced evidence that I had been working directly with some of grandfather's businesses for over a year, brought in as a consultant on special projects, contributing to strategic planning and operational improvements without ever knowing the connections. The management teams had been instructed to evaluate my work objectively, without revealing my family relationships, and their assessments had been uniformly positive. I had been solving real business problems, generating measurable results, proving my capabilities in the actual organizations I was now inheriting. The family was beginning to understand that this inheritance wasn't a sentimental gesture or an act of favoritism, but the result of careful evaluation and deliberate preparation that had been going on for years. Grandfather had been testing me, training me, and positioning me for this role while they were busy dismissing me as irrelevant. But even as the evidence mounted, even as they began to understand the depth of grandfather's planning and my secret qualifications, I could see that accepting this new reality was going to be difficult for people who had spent decades defining themselves in relation to my supposed failure. Marcus was struggling with the fact that his business degree and corporate experience had been valued less than my community service and value-based leadership. Sarah was grappling with the realization that her legal expertise had been seen as less important than my ability to build relationships and trust. They were all facing the uncomfortable truth that they had been measuring success by the wrong standards, focusing on credentials and accomplishments, while missing the deeper qualities that grandfather truly valued. The lawyer was now explaining the practical next steps, the transition process that would allow me to assume leadership responsibilities while maintaining stability for the businesses and their employees. There were advisory boards and management teams already in place, systems designed to support my development while ensuring continuity of operations. Grandfather had even arranged for experienced mentors who would guide me through the complexities of running multiple enterprises, successful leaders who had agreed to share their wisdom and experience. But beyond the business considerations, there were also family implications to address, relationships that would need to be rebuilt on new foundations now that the power dynamics had shifted so dramatically. I could see my family members processing not just the financial implications of grandfather's decisions, but the personal and emotional impact of having their assumptions about me so completely overturned. Some of them were beginning to look ashamed, recognizing how they had treated me, how they had dismissed and overlooked someone who had been quietly preparing for significant responsibilities. Others were still struggling with anger and disbelief, unable to accept that their expectations had been so wrong. But as I sat there absorbing the magnitude of what had happened, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me, a peace that came from finally understanding my place in grandfather's larger plan. The conversation in the room was becoming more practical now, with the lawyer explaining timelines and procedures, legal requirements and filing deadlines, all the administrative details that would formalize my new status. But I was thinking about something deeper, about the responsibility I now carried not just for businesses and assets, but for the values and principles that had guided grandfather's entire life. This inheritance was not just wealth, but a mission, not just resources, but an obligation to use those resources in ways that would serve others and honor his memory. As the meeting finally concluded and family members began gathering their belongings, I could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of shock and confusion and perhaps the beginning of a new kind of respect. Marcus approached me hesitantly, his earlier anger replaced by something that might have been curiosity, asking if we could talk sometime about the businesses and how I planned to manage them. Sarah was more cautious, still processing the legal implications, but I could see her beginning to accept the reality of what had happened. The others were leaving quietly, each dealing with their own disappointment and surprise, but without the bitter anger I had feared might emerge. Over the following weeks, as news of the inheritance spread through our extended family and social circles, I watched people struggle to reconcile their old perceptions of me with the new reality of my position and responsibilities. Some relationships were damaged beyond repair, built as they had been on assumptions of my inferiority and their superiority. But others began to heal and grow, especially with family members who were willing to admit they had misjudged me and were genuinely interested in understanding who I really was. The most surprising changes came from Marcus and Sarah, who gradually began reaching out with questions and offers of help, perhaps recognizing that their expertise could still be valuable in this new family dynamic. They were learning to see me not as the disappointment they had always assumed I was, but as someone who had been preparing for this role in ways they hadn't understood or appreciated. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, and there were still moments of tension and awkwardness as we all adjusted to the new reality. But slowly, tentatively, we began building new relationships based on who we actually were rather than who we had assumed each other to be. I made it clear from the beginning that I valued their skills and experience, that I wanted their input and advice as I learned to manage the responsibilities grandfather had entrusted to me. This approach seemed to help them process their disappointment while finding ways to contribute meaningfully to the family legacy. The businesses themselves provided another avenue for rebuilding relationships, as I invited family members to take on roles that matched their abilities and interests, positions where they could use their talents in service of grandfather's mission rather than just their own advancement. Marcus found himself energized by working on community development projects that used business principles to create social impact. Sarah discovered satisfaction in using her legal skills to protect worker rights and ensure ethical business practices. They were learning what I had already discovered through my work with grandfather, that true fulfillment comes from using your abilities to serve something greater than yourself. As months passed, I settled into my new responsibilities with a growing sense of confidence and purpose, supported by the advisory teams grandfather had assembled and guided by the principles he had taught me through our countless conversations. The family dynamics continued to evolve, with some relationships growing stronger and others finding new equilibrium based on mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchy. We gathered for holidays and celebrations that felt different now, conversations that included me as an equal participant rather than a tolerated disappointment. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when old patterns would surface and have to be consciously redirected toward healthier interactions. But overall, the family was learning to function in ways that honored each person's contributions while acknowledging the leadership role grandfather had chosen for me. The most profound change was in how I saw myself, finally understanding that grandfather had seen qualities in me that I had barely recognized, potential that had been developing through years of service and learning and relationship building. Looking back now, I can see that this entire experience was about more than inheritance or family dynamics or business succession. It was about the difference between being valued for what you appear to be and being valued for who you actually are, about the importance of measuring people by their character rather than their credentials. Grandfather had spent his life building not just businesses and wealth, but relationships and values and principles that would outlast any material legacy. And somehow, through all those quiet conversations and shared moments, he had been preparing me to carry forward not just his empire, but his understanding of what it means to build something that truly matters. The storm outside had finally passed, and sunlight was streaming through the windows of my new office, illuminating documents and decisions that would shape the future of thousands of employees and their families. I thought about grandfather often, imagining his satisfaction at seeing his plans unfold, his values being carried forward by someone who had learned to measure success not by accumulation but by service. The family that had once dismissed me as a disappointment had learned to see me differently, and more importantly, I had learned to see myself as someone worthy of the trust and responsibility that had been placed in my hands. Sometimes the people who believe in us most can see things we cannot see in ourselves, and sometimes the greatest gifts come not from being given what we want, but from being trusted with what we can become. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that your worth is not determined by other people's recognition, then you understand what grandfather was really trying to teach all of us about legacy and love and the quiet strength that changes the world one relationship at a time.